Jake Sullivan was stopped in his doorway, and the blood on the snow should have been the first indicator that anything was wrong. Staring at the red path that went from the edge of the forest to a small black object. The Montana snowstorm howled around him as he hid against the steps of his porch. All he could hear was his heart. The familiar beat that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan was thundering in his ears. The tiny creature he thought was a lost dog that night would impact his life in ways that no conflict ever could. Would turn into something that would scare even the most experienced wildlife experts. But Jake had no idea he was about to elevate that chilly February night. One of nature's strongest predators, and his own son, the ball of black fur, was barely living. The creature's eyes were still closed when Jake went to his knees next to it. It was no bigger than a coffee mug. Its body shaking furiously against the wind that is 20 degrees below zero. Before we go on this amazing trip, if stories of amazing relationships between people and wild animals move you, think about signing up for Wild Heart Stories. Every subscription helps us share more of these amazing stories. That love knows no bounds in the animal kingdom. Your aid gets the word out that occasionally, the wildest hearts are the most loyal friends. Jake had moved to this rural part of Montana 6 months ago. He wanted to be alone after the Veterans Administration doctors stopped trying to help him with his PTSD. With medicines and therapy sessions. The nightmares came every night without fail. Phantom booms that shook him awake, the faces of fallen brothers haunting his every tranquil moment. His cabin, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, was supposed to be his stronghold of solitude. A spot where he could break apart without anyone watching. The puppy, if that is what it was, weighed like little in his hands. Jake slid it beneath his flannel shirt, felt the small heartbeat flicker across his chest. As he stumbled back inside, 20 years of military training kicked in as he grabbed towels from the bathroom, fired up the wood stove, and began the delicate process of warming the frozen critter. The ice crystals on its fur thawed slowly, revealing a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. As Jake worked, gently rubbing circulation back into the little limbs, he noted the paws seemed strangely huge. For such a little animal, yet weariness and concern overrode any deeper study. "Come on, little man," Jake muttered, his voice scratchy from disuse. He had not talked to another living thing in weeks. "Do not give up on me now." The creature twitched slightly, a feeble cry escaping its mouth. Jake had seen enough death to identify when something was battling to live, and this tiny thing was fighting hard. He combined warm water with some canned milk he had in the pantry, using a dropper he discovered in his first aid kit. Must carefully feed the animal drop by drop. Life seemed to return to the small body. Around 3 in the morning, it was breathing steadily, curled up in a nest of towels close to the wood stove. Jake sat in his recliner watching the rise and fall of the little chest. For the first time in months, his mind was not repeating combat scenarios or calculating threat evaluations of his surroundings. Instead, he was entirely concentrated on this small life he had dragged from the storm. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, the next morning, both Jake and the puppy were still alive. However, Jake would later recall, since this was the night both their lives actually began. The nearest veterinarian was in Whitefish. A 2-hour commute on excellent days. The roads were still heavy with snow, but Jake bundled the puppy, whom he had started calling Shadow for his dark clothing, and began the dangerous voyage. Dr. Patricia Mills has been treating animals in Montana for 30 years, and she scarcely looked up when Jake walked in, holding what seemed to be a German Shepherd mix. "Dog found him in the storm," Jake explained. His statement short and efficient. "Need to make sure he is okay." Patricia's assessment was comprehensive but formulaic. "Probably about 2 weeks old," she said, inspecting Shadow's gums and teeth. "Definitely some shepherd in there. Maybe some husky by the look of those paws." He's emaciated but should heal okay with good care. You planning to retain him? Jake had not actually pondered the question until that moment. He had acted on instinct, preserving a life because it required saving. Yet when Shadow's small paw wrapped around his finger, he felt something change in his chest. Yeah, he heard himself say, I am keeping him. Patricia brought antibiotics, deworming medication, and a specialist puppy diet. He will need feeding every 4 hours. For the next few weeks, she explained. It is a significant commitment. Sure you are up for it? Jake thought about his empty cabin, his sleepless evenings, his purposeless days. I have got nothing but time, DOC. The drive home was quiet, save for Shadow's periodic whimpers from the cardboard box on the passenger seat. Jake found himself talking to the dog, explaining the trip, pointing out landmarks. His voice scratchy but gradually warming. That is where the elk cross in spring, he remarked, referring to a meadow. And that ridge there, that is where the eagles nest. Back at the cabin, Jake put himself into caring for Shadow. With military precision, feeding schedules were maintained to the minute. He kept meticulous logs of weight increase, behavior changes, and developmental milestones. The dog responded to the regimen by thriving. Within a week, Shadow's eyes had opened, exposing beautiful golden irises. It looked too sophisticated for such a young animal. Jake would spend hours sitting on the floor, letting Shadow explore his lap and suck on his fingers with tiny needle teeth. The nightmares did not end totally, although they happened less frequently. When they did wake him, Jake would check on Shadow, occasionally taking the puppy to bed with him, where the small warm weight against his chest would calm his beating heart. Shadow seemed to sense Jake's worry even as young as he was, often awakening and nuzzling Jake's hand during the worst of the dreams. Tom Henderson, Jake's nearest neighbor, stopped by 3 weeks after the rescue. Tom was a retired sheriff who made it his mission to check on the various hermits and recluses spread over the valley. He took one look at Shadow and whistled low. That is a large puppy, Tom noted. Shadow was already the size of a full-grown beagle, his paws ridiculously large for his physique. What is he, 8 weeks? For weeks, Jake adjusted, showing Tom the veterinary paperwork. Tom's eyebrows climbed. For weeks? Jesus, Jake, what are you giving him, steroids? It was meant as a joke, but it placed the first seed of dread in Jake's head. Shadow was developing at an unbelievable rate. His appetite was ferocious, transitioning from formula to solid meals earlier than any guidance indicated. His coordination grew swiftly also. By 5 weeks, he was running with a flowing grace. Things felt almost magical. Yet Jake, alone in his cabin with restricted internet and no television, with no actual frame of reference for typical puppy development, Shadow's intelligence appeared early. He learned his name within days, arrived when called, and seemed to grasp sophisticated commands that Jake had not even purposely trained. When Jake said nighttime, Shadow would trot to his blanket by the stove. When Jake got his coat, Shadow would wait at the entrance. It was as if the animal could read his intents before he fully formed them himself. The tie between them increased with each new day. Jake found himself arranging his entire routine around Shadow's requirements. Morning walks became trips into the forest, with Shadow exhibiting an incredible ability to track odors and navigate terrain. The dog exhibited no fear of the wilderness that's surrounding them, going through the trees. An underlying confidence that Jake found both remarkable and slightly disconcerting. By week 6, Shadow had tripled in size again. His black coat had grown thick and shiny, with an undercoat so dense the snow scarcely penetrated it. His teeth, when Jake looked them, were longer and sharper than seemed usual. But what did Jake know about Normal? He had never owned a dog before, had never been responsible for anything except accomplishing tasks and keeping his soldiers alive. This was wholly new area. The first truly weird incidents occurred on a March morning when Shadow was 7 weeks old. Jake had let him out for his morning pee break and was making coffee when he heard a disturbance in the yard. Running outdoors, he discovered Shadow standing over a dead rabbit, blood on his muzzle, the kill clean and efficient. The puppy glanced up at Jake with those amber eyes, tail bouncing, evidently happy of his achievement. "How the hell did you capture a rabbit?" Jake asked the morning air. Shadow was not even 2 months old, although he had hunted and killed prey with the competence of an adult predator. Jake cleaned up the rabbit, upset but rationalized that some dogs simply have stronger hunting instincts. Mountain dogs have to be tough, after all. Patricia Mills was not available when Jake called the veterinary clinic for guidance. But the receptionist told him that some puppies were just natural hunters. Definitely had some wolf hybrid in him. She suggested casually, not knowing how prescient her remarks would prove to be. The comment should have prompted more worry. Yet Jake was too engaged in the day-to-day realities of caring for Shadow to think deeply about it. The dog, despite his remarkable size and powers, was friendly and loyal. He followed Jake around, slept pressed up his legs, and appeared to sense Jake's feelings better than any human ever had. When dread crept up Jake's spine, Shadow would emerge at his side, lying against him with firm, reassuring weight. As nightmares woke him, Shadow would already be attentive, looking over him like a guardian. By the end of March, Shadow weighed 40 pounds. His paws were big, his head large and robust, his legs lengthy and muscled. When he stood next to Jake's dining table, his head nearly reached the surface. Neighbors who occasionally stopped by began making statements that were increasingly alarmed. "Jake, that is not a regular dog," Tom commented after one visit, seeing Shadow pace the cabin with fluid predatory grace. "I have seen a lot of dogs in my time. And that, it is something else." "He's merely huge for his age," Jake defended, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The vet stated he might have some husky in him. Tom looked doubtful but did not push. Mountain folk minding their own business. And if Jake chose to elevate whatever darkness was evolving into, that was his choice. But Tom made a mental note to keep his own animals locked up tight when he returned home. The fact that Jake was not ready to confront was becoming increasingly clear. Shadow's cry, when he first spoke it on a full moon night in early April, was not the bark cry of a dog. It was something primal, something that penetrated into the primitive portion of Jake's brain and made every hair stand on end. The sound carried for miles over the valley. A sad loud call that spoke of wildlands and ancient liberties. More clues collected like proof. Jake was not ready to analyze the way Shadow's eyes reflected light in the darkness. Gleaming like green fire, his preference for raw meat over kibble, the way he traveled through the jungle in utter stillness. Despite his rising stature, the way other dogs reacted to him with quick submission. Or horror, the way he watched the woodland line at night, vigilant to movements and sounds Jake could not perceive. But for Jake, Shadow was redemption. The dog, or whatever he was, had given him purpose again. The tight structure of care and training, the physical activity of their increasingly extended excursions. The camaraderie that asked nothing but presence, all of it was gently stitching Jake back together. His prescription lay unused in the cabinet. His therapy appointments were forgotten. Shadow was healing him in ways no human intervention had managed. When April came to May, Shadow's development showed no signs of slowing. At what Jake assumed to be 3 months old, Shadow weighed 70 pounds of pure muscle and sinew. His coat was fantastic, so black that had blue hues in the sun, thick enough that Jake's fingertips disappeared when he petted him. Those amber eyes contained an intellect that sometimes made Jake feel like he was the pet. Not the other way around. The critical event happened on a May evening when Shadow was reportedly 14 weeks old. Jake had been splitting wood behind the cottage when he heard it, a deep rumbling growl that made his blood freeze. He turned to discover Shadow standing between him and the forest edge, hackles flared, lips drawn back, to display teeth that were obviously too long, too sharp, too many for any canine breed. Jake sensed a mountain lion came from the trees, drawn perhaps by the scent of the deer Jake had processed the day before. It was a huge male, probably 200 pounds. And it looked at Jake like he was nothing more than another food alternative. Jake's rifle was inside the cabin, 20 feet away. He clutched the axe handle, knowing it would be worthless against those claws and fangs. Shadow went forward, positioning himself firmly between Jake and the animal. The sound that erupted from his throat was nothing like a dog's warning bark. It was a roar of challenge, a promise of violence that made the mountain lion pause. Shadow, at 70 pounds, should have been nothing but a lunch for the enormous cat. However, something about his position, his voice, his presence, spoke of a predator recognizing another predator. The standoff lasted probably 30 seconds, though it felt like hours to Jake. The mountain lion gradually backed away, vanishing into the bush with a final snarl of dissatisfaction. Shadow maintained his guarding stance until the attacker was entirely gone, then turned to Jake with tail wagging, like if he had just done a simple trick. Jake sunk to his knees, adrenaline making his hands trembling as he buried them in Shadow's thick fur. "What are you, boy?" he muttered. "What are you truly?" That night, Jake sat at his computer, utilizing his limited internet to research. He typed in Shadow's qualities, the size, the growth rate, the hunting ability, the vocalization, the eye color, the coat, the conduct. The data that came back made him close the laptop with shaking fingers. Every search led to the same conclusion, the same implausible answer. Things he was not ready to accept. But Shadow, cooled at his feet, warm and solid and real, did not care what the internet stated he might be. He was Jake's comrade, Jake's guardian. Jake's incentive to keep going as the darkness crept in. Whatever truth was growing alongside Shadow's magnificent body, it would have to wait. Certain facts demanded their own timing, and Jake was not ready to confront this one. As May passed, the signs were clear. Shadow's hunting expeditions grew bolder. He would leave for hours, returning with evidence of successful kills. His cries, always at night, were answered now by distant calls from the mountains, wild noises that made Jake's skin crawl. Even as Shadow's ears perked with excitement, the puppy that had fit in Jake's palm was becoming something gorgeous and scary in equal measure. Local ranchers started reporting unusual wolf activity, though no wolves had been documented in this section of Montana for decades. Sheep stayed nervous, dogs reluctant to leave their porches at night, and more than one individual claimed to have seen a large black form moving through the woodlands. Jake kept Shadow closer to home, but he could not cage. What was becoming increasingly evident was not supposed to be caged. The morning that would change. Things started like any other. Jake awakened to see Shadow staring him from across the room. Beautiful amber eyes possessing depths that no dog's eyes should contain. They went through their morning routine. Morning Jake's coffee, Shadow's raw beef, a walk along their customary track. But Jake could not shake the sense. Knew something was moving, that the delicate equilibrium they had maintained was ready to tip. He was right. Change was coming in the shape of a routine veterinary visit that would shatter the illusion Jake had carefully maintained. The truth about Shadow could not be avoided much longer. And with it would come choices Jake never dreamed he would have to make. The abandoned puppy he had saved. was about to unveil itself as something that would test all Jake believed he knew about the link between human and animal. But that morning, going across the Montana woods with Shadow padding silently by him, Jake allowed himself to exist in the calm they had made together. Whatever Shadow truly was, he had saved Jake as definitely as Jake had saved him. The storm that had brought them together was tiny compared to the storm that was about to explode when the world discovered what was residing in Jake Sullivan's cabin. The veterinarian clinic in Whitefish had seen its share of odd creatures throughout the years, but nothing quite prepared Dr. Patricia Mills for what stepped through her door on Tuesday morning. In late May, Jake had called ahead for Shadow's four-month checkup, though by his calculations, the animal was actually closer to 16 weeks old. What entered the testing room yet violated every expectation Patricia had built in 30 years of veterinary practice. Shadow had to dip his head to pass through the usual door frame at 90 pounds. He moved with a fluid grace that made the floor vibrate slightly with each step. His shoulders were strong and muscular, his chest deep, his legs long and built for endurance jogging. When he looked at Patricia with those penetrating amber eyes, she took an instinctive step backward, her basic brain recognizing something that her cerebral intellect was still fighting to deny. "This cannot be the same puppy you brought in 3 months ago," Patricia replied, her voice carefully controlled, even as her hands trembled slightly. "Jake, this animal is the size of a fully grown Great Dane." "But he is built like what, DOC?" Jake inquired. Though he already knew what she was straining to say, the phrase hung unspoken between them, too impossible to express in the luminous normality of the examining room. Patricia approached Shadow slowly, her motions deliberate and non-threatening. To her surprise, Shadow sat calmly, allowing her to run her hands over his body despite his eyes never left her face. His muscles were hard under the thick black coat, his bone structure huge and unusual from any domestic dog she had ever examined. When she glanced at his teeth, she had to repress a gasp. The canines were about 2 inches long, built for grasping and shredding. Not the teeth of an animal meant to eat food from a bowl. "Jake, I need to be clear with you," Patricia commented, stepping back from the examination table that Shadow made look laughably little. "This is not a dog. I do not know how or why, but what you have here is not any kind of domestic dog I have ever seen." Jake's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "He was dying in the snow. I could not just leave him." "I am not saying you did anything," Patricia replied softly, "but we need to understand out what he genuinely is. There are legal ramifications, safety problems, not to mention the biological impossibility of what I am looking at. Would you consent to a DNA test?" The wait for findings was scheduled to take 2 weeks. Patricia expedited it, paying extra from her own wallet, because she had to know, she had to understand what was standing in her clinic. Wearing a collar and leash like a pet when every instinct in her body shouted that this was an apex predator. During those 2 weeks Jake found himself watching Shadow with fresh eyes. The animal's conduct became impossible to rationalize as mere dog peculiarities. Shadow had begun patrolling the perimeter of Jake's land each night, charting territory in a large circle that stretched several acres. His cries, which came every nightfall, now were being replied by numerous voices from the deep woods, discussions in a language Jake could not comprehend. But that made his hair stand on end. The hunting had escalated too, Shadow no longer concerned with rabbits or squirrels. Jake had uncovered the carcass of a young buck not 100 yards from the cabin, taken down and largely consumed. With surgical precision. The slaughter had been clean, professional, the work of an animal that knew exactly where to bite to bring rapid death. When Jake approached Shadow about it, the animal had merely glanced at him with those intelligent eyes as if to say this was his nature, take it or leave it. But It was the protective behavior that affected Jake the most. Shadow had assigned himself Jake's guardian, a duty he took seriously enough that even Tom Henderson had stopped making unannounced visits. The former sheriff had made the mistake of approaching Jake from behind during a walk. And Shadow's reaction had been quick and horrifying, no actual violence. Only a positioning of his body, a growl from his chest, and a flash of teeth that made Tom pause in his tracks. Until Jake called Shadow off. "That is not a pet, Jake," Tom had said later, sweat thumping on his forehead. Despite the chilly mountain air. "That is a weapon with hair." Jake wanted to argue, but how could he? Shadow was becoming something that questioned every concept of what a pet should be. However, when they were alone in the cabin, Shadow was compassionate, sympathetic, even fun in his own dignified way. He would put his big head on Jake's lap as Jake read, his way to calming presence. He seems to sense Jake's moods with amazing accuracy, offering distraction during anxiety episodes. Calm companionship at the dark moments when memories of conflict threaten to overwhelm. The DNA findings arrived on a Thursday morning that started with strange bird activity. Around the cottage, ravens, dozens of them, had collected in the woods, their loud calls producing an unsettling soundtrack. As Jake drove to the veterinary clinic, Shadow sat in the back of Jake's truck. Attention to every movement, every sound, as if he knew something major was going to happen. Patricia's face when she delivered Jake the findings told him everything before he even looked at the paper. Her professional serenity was cracked, replaced with a mixture of astonishment and concern. That made Jake's gut clench. He looked down at the genetic study report, the technical terminology whirling before his eyes until one paragraph came into full focus. Canis lupus occidentalis northwestern wolf 100% match. "This is impossible," Patricia remarked, pacing her office while Jake sat numbly in the chair, the paper quivering in his hands. "A full wolf, not even a hybrid." "Jake, do you understand what this means?" Jake knew exactly. He had not saved an abandoned puppy, he had taken in a wolf pup, trained it as a dog, developed a bond that should not exist between a wild predator and a broken person. Everything made sense now. The quick growth, the hunting ability, the cries, the intelligence that went beyond canine comprehension. Shadow was not Shadow at all, he was a wolf, specifically a northwestern wolf. One of the largest subspecies in North America. He must have been the runt, Patricia continued, thinking out loud. Abandoned by his pack during that snow. Mother presumably had too many pups to feed, left the weakest behind. It happens in nature. Cruel yet vital for survival of the pack. "What should I do now?" Jake inquired. His voice hollow, the thought of losing Shadow, of having him taken away, felt something in his chest constrict cruelly. Patricia stopped pacing and looked at him with sympathy. "Legally you are supposed to report this to Fish and Wildlife. Harboring a wolf without permissions is a federal violation. They will want to relocate him to a sanctuary. Maybe restore him to the wild." She paused, examining Jake's sad face. "Realistically you have some time to figure this out, but Jake, you need to understand the danger here. Wolves are not pets. As he ages his instincts will get stronger, he could hurt you or worse. Hurt someone else." The drive home was silent save for Shadow's occasional whine from the back. Sensing Jake's sorrow, Jake's imagination raced through scenarios, each more implausible than the last. He could not give Shadow up, not when the wolf was the only thing standing between him and the depths of his PTSD. Because holding him was illegal, potentially hazardous, and ethically problematic. Was it fair to Shadow to keep him from his own kind? Was it safe for Jake to share his home with an animal capable of murdering him with a single bite? That night Jake sat on his porch with Shadow behind him. Both watched the moon rise over the mountains. Shadow's howl, when it came, was different this time, sorrowful and inquisitive, as if he too sensed that something had changed between them. The answering calls from the forest seemed closer tonight, more urgent. "You belong out there, do not you?" Jake whispered softly, brushing his fingers through Shadow's thick fur. "With them, not with me." Shadow focused those golden eyes on Jake, and for a moment Jake could have believed he saw understanding there. Maybe even disagreement. The wolf leaned against Jake's leg, a gesture of devotion that seemed to convey he had already decided where he belonged. Over the next days Jake pushed himself into studies about wolves. About their behavior, their wants, their social structures. What he learned both enthralled and horrified him. Wolves were apex predators, yeah, but they were also extremely sociable beings with complicated emotional lives. They created friendships that lasted lifetimes, displayed loyalty that put mankind to shame, and demonstrated intelligence that exceeded monkeys. The more Jake read, the more he understood that Shadow's behavior toward him was not standard wolf behavior at all, somehow impossible. Shadow had imprinted on him as family. The first test came a week after the DNA results, when a group of actual wolves came at the edge of Jake's land. Jake woke to discover Shadow standing at the window, every muscle taut, watching 5 wolves grouped in a semicircle near the tree line. They were wonderful beasts, yet none possessed Shadow's flawless black coat or striking size. The alpha, a grizzled gray male, took a step forward and howled a clear invitation or challenge. Jake's hand moved to his rifle, but Shadow turned and looked at him, truly shaking his head. In a move so human-like that Jake froze. The wolf padded to the door and waited. Against every impulse, every shred of common sense, Jake opened it. Shadow walked out gently, his movement confident but not aggressive. The pack watched him approach, their body language moving from curiosity to acquiescence as they seemed to recognize something in him that Jake could not comprehend. The gray alpha dropped his head slightly, not quite submission but acknowledgement. For 10 minutes Shadow stood among his own kind, and Jake waited for him to disappear into the jungle where he belonged, but Shadow turned back. He went away from the pack, walked to Jake's porch, and sat down alongside the human who had nurtured him. The message was obvious. He had made his choice. The troop drifted back into the bush and Jake went to his knees, overwhelmed by the significance of what had just happened. "You choose me," he muttered, and darkness leaned into him, nearly knocking him over with his weight. News started circulating through the valley about Jake's unique dog. People discussed in the general shop, at the gas station, in the cafe where Jake never went but where his narrative circulated anyway. Most disregarded it as mountain folk hyperbole, but some, especially the ranchers, who had lost animals to wolf predation, started asking difficult questions. Jake knew he was living on borrowed time. Someone would ultimately denounce him to the authorities, or Shadow would do something that could hardly be explained away as aggressive dog behavior. Yet each day that passed tightened the tie between them. Shadow learned to adjust his behavior among the few humans he encountered, never exhibiting hostility until Jake was threatened. He even tolerated Tom Henderson's infrequent visits, though he observed the retired sheriff with unblinking concentration that made Tom sweat. The alteration in Jake was even more remarkable than Shadow's unfathomable growth. The nightmares had not stopped totally, although they came rarely anymore. The hypervigilance that had made grocery shopping a misery had mellowed into manageable awareness. He had not touched his anxiety medication in weeks. The continual mental playback of conflict scenarios had been replaced by emphasis on Shadow's training and care. The wolf had done what no therapist could accomplish. Gave Jake a purpose that drew him out of his own shattered head. Patricia called regularly, checking in under the premise of following up on Shadow's health but really watching the situation for signals of danger. She had not reported the DNA results to anyone, a violation of protocol that might cost her license. But she had seen something in Jake's eyes that day, a desperation that called to her healer's heart. She excused it by telling herself she was seeing a rare situation, gathering research on human-wolf bonding. That may be helpful to research. How is he? She would ask. Growing, Jake would answer. Which was understatement. Shadow now weighed 120 pounds and was still putting on muscle. But good, we are good, Jake, you know this cannot go forever. I know. Although knowing and accepting were two different things. The incident that would force Jake's hand came on a sultry July evening when Shadow was approximately 6 months old, yet he looked like a fully developed wolf. A bunch of hikers, confused and terrified as darkness fell, stumbled across Jake's property. Shadow's response was swift and protective, placing himself between Jake and the strangers. After a display of territorial violence that left no mistake about his nature, the trekkers fled the moment Jake called Shadow back, but not before one of them videotaped the encounter on a cell phone. Within days the video was circulating on social media, with tags like "Montana man keeps wild wolf as pet and is this legal?" The attention Jake had badly wanted to avoid was coming whether he was ready or not. Tom Henderson showed in the next morning with a sad expression, "Fish and fauna will be here within the week." He cautioned. Someone from the state office phoned me asking questions. Jake, you need to determine what you are going to do. Jake stared at Shadow, who was laying in a patch of sunlight looking for all the world like an overgrown dog, enjoying a relaxing morning. But Jake knew better. He had seen Shadow take down a full-sized elk 3 days ago, had witnessed him speak with the wild pack that still visited occasionally, had felt the primal power stored in that black-furred body. What would you do? Jake asked Tom. Tom remained quiet for a long period, watching Shadow study them with those two intelligent eyes. I had a partner once, he finally said. Best officer I ever worked with, saved my life more times than I can count. When the department intended to retire him for some bureaucratic bullshit reason, I battled like hell to keep him. Lost my promotion over it. He stopped. He was simply a human. What you have got there saved your life in a different way, did not he? Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Then you fight, Tom stated simply. You find a method to make it legal or you find a way to escape, but you do not allow them take him. If he does not want to depart. After Tom left, Jake sat with Shadow on the porch. Both of them looked out at the nature that had brought them together. The authorities were arriving. Decisions had to be made. The fairy tale of a man and his dog was ending. The intricate reality of a human-wolf link was about to be challenged in ways neither of them could completely anticipate. But in that moment, with Shadow's warm weight on his side and the Montana mountains looming timeless about them, Jake made his choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The abandoned puppy who had turned out to be a wolf had protected him from his demons. Now it was Jake's turn to save Shadow from a world that would not understand what they had produced together. The sound of automobiles on the distant road made Shadow's ears flare up and Jake's palm sought the thick fur at the wolf's neck. The reckoning was coming sooner than imagined. All they had created, the trust, the love, the inconceivable relationship between warrior and wolf was about to be put to the ultimate test. The caravan of government cars that wound up Jake's dusty road on that July morning appeared like an invasion force. 2 trucks from Montana Fish and Wildlife, a sheriff's cruiser, and a veterinary transport van, suited for huge animal capture. Jake watched them approach from his window, his hand resting on Shadow's wide head. The wolf stood completely motionless, his muscles coiled with strain, feeling the harm these guests posed. "Easy, youngster," Jake muttered, but his own heart was beating with the familiar rhythm of imminent fight. We knew something was coming. Dr. Patricia Mills was with them. Jake noticed her presence. Both a comfort and a betrayal. She had held off as long as she could, but when the video went online, she had no choice but to confirm what she knew. Her face, through the windshield, appeared tortured, apologetic. The lead officer was a man named Richard Brennan, a 30-year veteran of wildlife services, who had witnessed every imaginable permutation of human-wildlife conflict. He approached Jake's porch with the tired authority of someone who anticipated obedience but was prepared for opposition. His hand rested casually on his tranquilizer gun, a gesture that made Shadow emit a low grumble. Sound seemed to resonate through the floorboards. "Mr. Sullivan," Brennan began, his voice professionally neutral, "we have received many reports and video evidence that you are harboring a wild wolf without legal licenses. We are here to assess the situation and take adequate action." Jake moved out onto the porch, Shadow quickly putting himself between Jake and the police. "He is not wild," Jake responded simply. "I raised him from 2 weeks old. He has never known any life but this one." Brennan's visage relaxed slightly, but his attitude remained solid. "That may be true, however, the law is clear: wolves are protected species and cannot be kept as pets. The animal has to be moved to a licensed facility or reintroduced to an appropriate natural habitat." "His name is Shadow," Jake stated, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who has commanded men in combat, "and he's not going anywhere. He does not want to go." The standoff lasted several tense minutes. Shadow never moved from his safe position, his amber eyes studying every human present with an intelligence that made several cops step back instinctively. His bulk was terrifying enough, but it was the controlled force, the sensation of a predator deciding not to attack, that made the situation feel like a powder keg. Hoping for a spark, Patricia finally broke the stillness. "Richard, may I?" She approached slowly, her motions delicate and non-threatening. "Jake, we need to find a solution here. Shadow is wonderful, but you have to consider the liability if he hurts someone, even accidentally. It is not only him who pays the price, it is you and it is every wolf in Montana. Who will suffer more persecution?" "He would never injure anyone," Jake insisted, but even as he spoke, he knew it was not fully true. Shadow would absolutely hurt someone if they threatened Jake. That protective instinct was ingrained into his DNA, enhanced by their relationship. "There might be another way," a fresh voice remarked. Tom Henderson had arrived, parking his pickup behind the official vehicles. Accompanying him was someone Jake did not expect, Judge Margaret Ellis, a former federal judge, who still retained substantial influence in Montana legal circles. She was also, Jake learned later, Tom's sister-in-law, Margaret Brennan, said, surprise obvious in his voice. "This is not really your jurisdiction. Wildlife law has always been an interest of mine." She reacted smoothly, "and I feel there is precedent for unique cases. Allows in circumstances of documented human-wildlife bonding that gives therapeutic benefit." She provided a folder filled with legal documentation. "Mr. Sullivan is a decorated veteran with confirmed PTSD. His medical records, which he has authorized me to consult, show substantial improvement since establishing his friendship with this beast." Jake gazed at Tom in wonder. The retired sheriff shrugged. "Told you I would help if I could." The talk proceeded inside, though Shadow refused to leave Jake's side, his huge presence making the small cabin feel even smaller. Judge Ellis set out her argument with the accuracy of someone who had spent decades drafting legal arguments. There were precedents, she said, unusual but existing, when special permits had been issued for therapeutic animal partnerships that fell outside customary regulations. The key, she stated, looking straight at Brennan, is establishing that the benefit to the human outweighs the potential risk and that suitable protections are in place. Brennan was unconvinced. Those precedents featured domesticated animals with wild lineage, not pure wolves. This is absolutely different. The conversation went for hours, with Shadow resting at Jake's feet, alert yet calm. Patricia presented medical testimony on Jake's change. Since locating Shadow, Tom testified about the controlled non-aggressive behavior he had watched. Even some of Jake's neighbors had shown up fascinated about the noise, and some spoke up about how Shadow had never displayed anger against them or their animals. It was late afternoon when things changed. A scream from outside drew everyone hurrying to the porch. One of the wildlife officers was backing away from the tree line, his face blanched with panic. Behind him, emerging from the forest, with the confident walk of an apex predator, was a big grizzly bear. The creature was visibly irritated, likely rabid by the foam around its mouth, and it had fixated on the gathering of humans as a threat or prey. Several officers rushed their rifles, but the bear was too close. Moving too fast, it would be on them before anyone could get a clean shot. Shadow moved like black lightning. One moment he was near Jake, the next he was between the people and the bear, his body low. A snarl breaking from his throat that made everyone, including the bear, freeze. The bear outweighed Shadow by at least 300 pounds, however, the wolf showed no fear. No doubt this was his turf, these were his humans to defend. The confrontation was swift but intense. Shadow did not strike, but his stance, his vocalization, his sheer presence communicated something primordial to the bear. This was not prey behavior, this was predator encountering predator. And the wolf was making it obvious that the cost of advancing would be paid in blood. The bear, possibly understanding that even victory would come with horrific wounds, chose retreat. It huffed, shrugged its enormous head, and lumbered back into the forest. Shadow maintained his defensive stance till the bear was totally out of sight, then quietly strolled back to Jake's side, as if he had merely completed a commonplace duty. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone present has just observed something that challenged their understanding of animal behavior. A wolf bred by a human had just sacrificed his life to protect not just his bonded human, but strangers, some of whom were there to take him away. Brennan was the first to speak, his voice weak. That bear would have killed someone. Maybe multiple someones. Shadow just saved our lives, one of the younger officers commented, all obvious in his tone. Judge Ellis seized the moment. Gentlemen, I believe you just observed exactly why this link should be protected, not severed. This is not just a wild animal living with a human. This is a collaboration that benefits both species. The mood had shifted radically. The officers who had arrived ready to tranquilize and remove a dangerous wild animal. We're now looking at darkness with anything approaching reverence. Brennan ran a hand through his gray hair, his professional responsibilities warring with what he had just experienced. There would need to be conditions. He murmured slowly, and Jake's heart soared with hope. Frequent checks, secure fencing, liability insurance, no public appearances, and definitely no breeding. Agreed. Jake said instantly, and if there is any hostile incident, any attack on persons or livestock, the permission is immediately cancelled. Understood? Patricia spoke up. I would be willing to provide ongoing veterinary supervision, document the relationship for scientific purposes. This could be valuable research into human-wolf bonding. Over the next 2 hours they hammered out an agreement. It was unprecedented, possibly legally questionable, but it was a solution that everyone could live with. Shadow would be registered as a therapeutic support animal under a special exotic species permit. Jake would have to meet strict requirements, submit to regular inspections, and keep hefty liability insurance, but Shadow might stay. As the convoy prepared to leave, Brennan approached Jake privately. You know this is remarkable, right? We are violating a lot of boundaries here. I know, Jake replied. Thank you. Brennan stared at Shadow, who was watching the encounter with those unsettling intelligent eyes. That wolf would die for you and I for him, Jake said simply. Brennan nodded slowly. Take care of each other then, and for God's sake keep him away from people who do not understand what they are looking at. After everyone left, Jake sat on his porch with Shadow, the adrenaline of the day finally fading into exhaustion. The wolf leaned against him, a warm, solid presence that grounded him in reality. They had won against all odds. The abandoned puppy who turned out to be a wolf could stay with the broken soldier who had turned out to be healable. The story of Jake and Shadow spread throughout Montana and beyond. Though Jake did all possible to avoid publicity, scientists wanted to study them, documentary makers wanted to film them. Animal rights activists wanted to use them as either positive example or cautionary tale depending on their stance. Jake refused them all. This was not about making a statement or proving a point. This was about two damaged souls who had found healing in each other. The months that followed were not without challenges. Shadow's wild instincts could not be completely suppressed. He still hunted, though Jake managed to direct this toward controlling the overpopulated deer that plagued local gardens. He still held to the wild packs, though he never joined them. He still displayed protective aggression when strangers approached Jake, though he learned to regulate his response to Jake's vocal cues. Jake, on his part, had to modify his entire life around Shadow's requirements. No more outings to town with his companion, no more casual guests, no more pretending that Shadow was simply an interesting dog. He constructed 8-foot fencing around a 5-acre area of his property, though Shadow could have cleared it easily if he decided. The fence was more symbol than barrier, a line that indicated where the domestic ended and the wild began. The wild pack still visited frequently, drawn by Shadow's presence. Jake would watch from his window as Shadow interacted with them at the fence line, complex communications passing between them that Jake could not fully understand. Sometimes he wondered if Shadow regretted his choice, if the call of his own kind was stronger than the bond they shared, but Shadow always returned to the cabin, always chose to sleep beside Jake's bed, always positioned himself between Jake and any perceived threat. Patricia visited regularly, noting everything: Shadow's physical development, his behavior patterns, his relationship with Jake. All of it went into detailed notes that she hoped would eventually assist other people comprehend the depth of connection possible between humans and wild animals. She was particularly fascinated by Shadow's ability to detect Jake's mental condition, often responding to fear or anguish before Jake himself was completely aware of it. "He knows you better than you know yourself," she noted during one visit, watching Shadow nudge Jake away from a window where he had been standing, lost in some dark memory. "It is like he can smell your emotional changes." "He probably can," Jake replied automatically, responding to Shadow's redirection by sitting down and accepting the massive wolf head that landed in his lap, demanding attention. The first winter together as legal partners was harsh, with record snowfall that isolated the cabin for weeks at a time, but Jake found the isolation comfortable now rather than oppressive. Shadow thrived in the cold, his thick coat perfect for the Montana winter. They developed new routines. Morning patrols through the snow, afternoon naps by the fire, evening howling sessions where Jake would sit and listen as Shadow sang to the moon and received answers from the mountains. One night a blizzard greater than the one that had brought them together raged outside. Jake woke from a nightmare not of battle this time but of losing Shadow, of seeing him disappear into the jungle forever. He found Shadow already awake, watching him with those amber eyes that carried more understanding than any animal could possess. "I know you might leave," Jake whispered into the darkness. "Anytime you wanted, you could simply go, be what you were born to be." Shadow huffed softly and laid his head on the bed beside Jake's hand, a gesture of reassurance that needed no translation. This was what he was born to be, not just wolf but guardian, companion, friend. The choice had been made long ago in the snow and cold when two lost souls found each other. As spring arrived, bringing with it the first anniversary of their meeting, Jake reflected on the journey they had taken, from the tiny dying puppy that fit in his palm to the magnificent wolf that could take down an elk or face off a grizzly, from the broken soldier who could barely function to the man who had found purpose and peace in the most unlikely partnership. Tom Henderson stopped by on the anniversary day, bringing with him a local reporter who had been pestering him for months about the story. Jake was ready to refuse again, but Tom held up a hand. "Hear her out," he said. "She is not looking for sensation, she wants to write about veteran recovery, about alternative therapies, about the healing power of animal bonds. Shadow is merely part of a greater narrative." The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, was respectful and genuine. She did not want to sensationalize or exploit. She wanted to help other veterans who might be struggling, to show them that healing could come from unexpected places. "How many soldiers come home broken and never find their way back?" she asked. "Your story could help them." Jake looked at Shadow, who was watching the interaction with his usual keen focus. "What do you think, boy? Desire to be famous?" Shadow's response was to yawn enormously and flop down on the porch, clearly unimpressed with the idea of fame, but Jake saw something else in the wolf's relaxed posture, a confidence that said their bond was strong enough to withstand scrutiny, that their story was worth telling. "All right," Jake agreed, "but the focus stays on veteran recovery, not on Shadow being a wolf. He is just a very unusual therapy animal." The story, when it was published, struck exactly the correct tone. It talked about unconventional healing, about the relationships between humans and animals that transcend species, about finding hope in the most unexpected places. Shadow was acknowledged but not sensationalized. The article respected both Jake's privacy and Shadow's nature. The feedback was incredible. Veterans from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories of animal companions who had saved them from the darkness. Some had dogs, some had horses, one had a rescued hawk, but all had found what Jake had found, a reason to keep going, a bond that pulled them out of their own damaged minds and into a relationship that demanded presence and purpose. Jake started corresponding with some of them, sharing what he had learned about routine, about patience, about allowing oneself to be vulnerable with a creature that would never judge your weakness. Shadow would sit alongside him as he typed emails or wrote letters, occasionally prodding his elbow after he had been at it too long, reminding him that the physical world required care too. One evening, as the sun sank over the Montana mountains, Jake and Shadow sat in their normal location on the porch. The wolf pack was visible in the distance, going through the valley on some mysterious mission. Shadow watched them but made no move to join them. His choice had been made and remade every day for a year. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, "for choosing me, for staying." Shadow turned those remarkable amber eyes on Jake, and in them was everything that did not need to be said. The gratitude was mutual. The salvation was shared. The bond was unbreakable. As darkness fell, Shadow began his nightly howl, but this time Jake joined him, adding his human voice to the ancient song. It was awkward, probably ridiculous, certainly nothing like the pure wild music Shadow produced, but Shadow seemed to approve, his tail wagging slightly as they sang together to the rising moon. In the distance, the wild pack answered the voices, carrying across the valley in a harmony as old as time. But Shadow did not look toward them with longing anymore, he looked at Jake, his chosen pack, his rescued human, his purpose. The abandoned puppy who was never a puppy at all had grown into exactly what he was meant to be, not tame, not wild, but something in between, something unique. The future stretched before them, uncertain as always. There would be challenges. Jake knew Shadow would continue to age, continue to be what he was, a wolf living in a human world by choice rather than nature. Jake would continue to heal, continue to find pieces of himself he thought war had destroyed forever, but they would face it together, the veteran and the wolf, bound by a storm and a choice and a love that transcended species. As they went inside for the night, Shadow padding silently beside Jake, the moon rose full over the mountains. Somewhere in the forest the wild pack hunted and howled and lived as wolves had always lived, but in a small cabin in Montana a different kind of wolf curled up beside a human's bed, content with his choice, guarding the man who had saved him from the snow all those months ago. The storm that had brought them together had been fierce but brief, the bond they had built would last a lifetime. In saving each other they had discovered something precious and rare, a connection that proved love and loyalty know no boundaries, not of species, not of nature, not of what the world says is possible. They were living proof that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected places, and that family is not always defined by blood or species but by choice, by dedication, and by the simple act of refusing to give up on each other when the rest of the world says you should.